Welcome to the main art studio of Pedro Pablo Oliva in his hometown in Pinar del Río, Cuba. Today, we are opening a singular exhibition. This is a virtual exhibition of works by Master Pedro Pablo Oliva, made possible thanks to the initiative and cooperation of Artemorphosis Gallery in Switzerland. First, we want you to know a little about the visual universe of Pedro Pablo Oliva. We will show you 3 masterpieces in our collection that you can only see here in the studio. David Horta, critic and curator, will make a brief presentation of these 3 paintings where Oliva makes a chronicle of key moments in the recent history of Cuba. Welcome to the world of Pedro Pablo Oliva.
Behind me, you will find the unfinished miracle of the bread and the fish. This is one of the most important masterpieces which the master has kept for himself in his own private collection in his studio and residence. The unfinished miracle of the bread and the fish is part of a very long series which the artist started in the mid-1980s and which is called Wickerwork Chairs or Wicker Chairs. The title of the series, Wickerwork Chair, comes after the key central element which appears in every single painting of the series. This very typical wickerwork chairs which we found in many Cuban houses, where the artist places all kinds of characters that sit down there to have conversations, take a nap, dream, talk about love, sometimes even make love, and at times also key players in the Cuban political arena, like in this case, because the painting, The Unfinished Miracle of the Bread and the Fish, was made after the visit of John Paul II, the late Pope of the Catholic Church, in 1998. This is Oliva's visual documentary of the visit of John Paul II to Cuba. After decades of a very hostile and conflictive relationship between the Church and the government, the visit of the Pope, of John Paul II to Cuba in 1998, was received as a kind of a sign of change, a sign that new times were opening. So there was so much expectation about this visit. Everybody expected changes to happen. Changes of the relationship between the Church and the state, social, economic changes, changes in our civil liberties. And, some of those changes actually happened, and some of them never happened at all. So that is probably why the title of the painting chosen by the artist, The Unfinished Miracle of the Bread and the Fish. The painting was made in 1998, or actually it started in 1998. The artist signed the painting using the date where he came up with the idea of documenting this very important visit, but it was finished 2 years later. As you can see, it's a very large canvas and it's a very complex work, both formally and conceptually speaking. The painting was conceived to resemble one of those altarpieces which we find in very old churches, with a central panel and 2 lateral panels. In the painting, Oliva, as in many other masterpieces, mixes personal anecdotes, personal events happening in his private life, and also political and social events unfolding in Cuban reality at the time the painting was being made. In the central panel, we find the resemblances of Fidel Castro himself and John Paul II, carrying a fish on their lap. On the side of Fidel Castro, we will find many elements which refer to some very well-known religious symbolisms, like the fallen angel, like for instance the tree of knowledge or the tree of life, Adam and Eve, the original sin. On the right panel we find one of the key references to the Cuban political and social circumstance back in those years. Specifically the one that refers to the situation of the political opposition in Cuba. Here Oliva includes in the part of the painting which has not been finished, so the unfinished project, an image of the members of La Patria es de Todos. That was the name of the key opposition party that came out on those years. Fatherland is for all. Here you find the members of that party. The unfinished Miracle of the Bread and the Fish is one of the most iconic pieces made by Oliva to this day. It is also one of the examples of why he's been known as a chronicler of his times. And it's one of the most important masterpieces still in place in his own residence and studio in Pinar del Río. The Gran Abuelo, the big grandfather or the great grandfather, was a series of portraits of Fidel Castro made by Pedro Pablo Oliva starting in 2003. It was a series of very strange, unusual portraits of Fidel Castro by any standard. We Cubans were used to the image of the leader. Of course, we saw him in every single billboard, picture, film, on television. And Oliva came with this serious and a very different approach to the image of the leader. Here in The Great Grandfather, that's the title of the painting, was the second painting of the series and one of the key masterpieces in the series. We see this very old man, gray-haired, his eyes closed, sitting on an armchair with a cat on his lap, and the usual Commander-in-Chief uniform, the military fatigue we were so used to, has been turned into pajamas. This was a really odd image for us Cubans when it came out. We were not used to it. Fidel Castro was also, when we went on a public presentation, he was always standing, always like ready for a fight. He was full of energy, full of tension. Even when he was sitting in a Congress or a summit, he was so full of tension that it seemed as if at some point he would stand up and start talking. But this is such a quiet image that you can even see this fruit making a balancing act on the leader's head. And these lizards or chameleons are thriving around him. And he's like in the midst of a green ectoplasm, an eerie atmosphere, like otherworldly, like unreal. So the painting was not very well received, and since it came out, it has not been allowed to be publicly displayed. It can only be found here in the artist's main studio in Pinar del Río. It's one of the masterpieces in the artist's own collection. The reasons why this is such a controversial image and it has not been allowed to be publicly displayed is it may seem obvious at first time. All things Cuban, of course, this image of Pedro Pablo Oliva was subject to many interpretations, political interpretations especially. There were those on the other side of the Florida Strait that thought that the artist was being far too ambiguous, ambivalent in representing the image of what they thought was a ruthless dictator that had suppressed civil liberties in Cuba and has dealt this country into despair, into economic crisis. And on the other side, the cultural officials of the Cuban government thought he was being disrespectful, he was being subversive, and he was giving ideological and symbolic weapons to the enemy to discredit the image of the leader. What is true and what is false is difficult to say, because actually the series has got nothing to do with the political interpretation of the leader as it has to do with a human interpretation of this image, which was very important for Oliva. Oliva was 10 years old in 1959, so since he was a little child, he was used to see this image, and it was part of his life. He was part of the revolution. And the title of the series, The Great-Grandfather, probably has to do with that. Fidel Castro, in a way, could be seen as Oliva's grandfather. The artist has been reluctant to give the ultimate meaning of this painting or of the whole series. But he has said something that can make us understand what it is all about. His sole intention was to portray the human dimension of someone that for us Cubans was simply a social construct, the result of propaganda, a myth, a semi-god, which we saw every day of our lives in all those billboards and films and pictures. So there came a moment where Oliva realized that we didn't know him. I mean, who are you? How did we come to this? Was this true? And since all we know about you are these images, these films, who are you in real life? How are you as a human being? And that's what the series is all about. Oliva's attempt to portray the humanity of someone we actually didn't know. The Gran Apagón, the Great Blackout, was made in 1994. It is by far the best known painting made by Pedro Pablo Oliva to this date. It is part of a whole series of paintings made in the first half of the 1990s called Shelters. The painting was made at the peak of the worst economic, social, and political crisis we've been through in Cuba, right after the fall of socialism in Eastern Europe. And in every single aspect, the painting tries to mimic what we felt, what we saw, and what we expected of the future back in those days. After the collapse of socialism in Eastern Europe, Cuban leaders started speaking constantly in every single public speech about the imminent invasion by the United States to Cuba. We were the ripe fruit, we were ready to be taken. We were no longer under the economic, political, and military protectorate of the Soviet Union and the socialist country. So there was this sense of danger, of urgency, and this paranoia. And there was a program in the whole island in which, with aid from the government, in every community, every working center, every school, we started building small bunkers or galleries underground, shelters, to prepare for this supposed to come invasion from the United States. That's where the title of the series, Shelters, come from. And all the paintings of the series have in common this specific element, these bands here and up there, which were made to depict a cross-section of an underground gallery where everything in the painting happened. The shelters were not the only commonplace element in the scenario back in the early 90s. There were also the blackouts, very long power cuts, 12 hours long, 8 hours long power cuts that we suffered because of shortage of fuel. You couldn't even see your own hands in the middle of the night. So the Great Blackout refers to those times of darkness. But of course, not only physical darkness, it is also a metaphorical darkness. It refers to another sense, another meaning of the expression blackout, which is a temporary loss of consciousness. The whole world became dark. You can imagine, for us, the world was, safe and sound. It was really easy to understand. It was as easy as to understand that there was good and evil, east and west, socialism and capitalism. And all of a sudden, with the collapse of socialism, all these mental framework that made our world so safe and sound, so easy to understand, crumbled to the ground. And all certainties went down with it. Where are we? what is truth anymore? If this was not as solid as it seemed, what is solid anymore? Where do we come from and where are we going? All these questions were part of our daily lives back in those times. And the Great Blackout depicts this uncertainty, this sense of urgency, this perception of danger, this uncertainty about the future. In the words of the artist himself, the Great Blackout is his own personal vision of the political environment, of the psychological atmosphere, of the state of mind of Cuba back in those years. So you can see this painting as a kind of a metaphor. This is Cuba, underground, isolated in its own self, fearing the outside and in the middle of a blackout, where you cannot see clearly what lies in front of you, which is probably why there are so many eyes in the painting and so many characters trying to carry a candle, trying to see through darkness so hard that their eyes pop out. Elements in the painting that turned it into a very controversial topic of discussion back in 1995 when it was exhibited for the first time at the National Museum of Fine Arts in Havana. Some of those elements are very easy to understand. For instance, we have in this area here, we have this element which was a point of discussion. This is a podium with a Cuban flag. The only place in the painting where there is this vertical light falling on it. And the podium is empty. Here on the left we see Fidel Castro, the Cuban leader. The Great Blackout for the artist is a synthesis of Cuba and Cubans. It is a multi-layered portrait of Cuban social, political, and spiritual life. A circumstance full of shadows and light and the fight between them. It is a country trying to find its way out of the tunnel. When it was for the first time exhibited, it has been known as the Cuban Guernica. Of course, as a comparison to Pablo Picasso's famous mural painting. The artist both likes and dislikes the comparison. He says that, of course, who wouldn't like to be compared to Picasso? But on the other hand, he says that, if any, this is a Cuban Guernica. If the Picassian Guernica was a disenchanted song to modernity coming out of destruction and death, the Great Blackout is actually a song of life, a song to the light.